Overnight, something unthinkable happened. America's southern border froze. Trucks immobilized, warehouses stalled, tomatoes rotted under the Sonoran sun. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. Mexico had shut off the tap. Not a partial delay, not a bureaucratic hiccup, but a calculated decision by President Claudia Sheinbaum's government to halt a major portion of exports to the United States. For decades, the U.S. dictated the trade terms, but in one bold move, Mexico flipped the script and said, "We are not your silent supplier. We are your sovereign equal." And just like that, the most powerful economy in the world got blindsided. Supermarkets in Texas began issuing shortage alerts. Farmers panicked. Corporate America rushed to Washington. But by then it was too late. Mexico had already pivoted toward China, India, Brazil, and the UAE. Ports once dedicated to North America were now rerouted east and south. You're not just watching a trade spat. You're witnessing the fracture of a global order that assumed America would always be in control. So, here's the question. What does this really mean? Is this just a supply chain crisis, or the first domino in a post-American trade era? Let's break down what happened, why it matters, and what no one in Washington wants you to realize. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was a meticulously planned response to the Trump administration's aggressive second-term tariff regime. A 17% import tax on tomatoes. Fresh levies on Mexican steel and aluminum. Washington called it leverage. Mexico called it a red line. President Claudia Sheinbaum, flanked by her entire economic cabinet, delivered just one sentence in front of a tense press room. "If you block us, we'll close the door too." And she did. Within 48 hours, the border froze. Export lanes, once pulsing with thousands of tons of goods, ground to a halt. Trade that had quietly propped up billions in U.S. consumer conveniences, food, cars, electronics, was suddenly gone. For decades, Mexico had tolerated the imbalance, quiet compliance in exchange for economic access. But now, it wasn't about trade. It was about sovereignty. This was not a tantrum. This was strategy. The consequences hit fast and hard. Supermarkets across southern states like Texas and Arizona saw produce shelves empty within days. Walmart and Costco issued public shortage alerts. Car factories in Michigan faced parts delays. Prices for basic goods, tomatoes, avocados, aluminum spiked overnight. This wasn't just economic disruption, it was exposure. For the first time, everyday Americans realized the extent of their dependency on Mexico's supply lines. And the most shocking quote didn't come from a politician but from a Texan agribusiness executive live on CNBC. "We need them more than they need us." The phrase reverberated across media cycles. Lawmakers scrambled. Lobbyists stormed Capitol Hill. But Mexico didn't blink. While the U.S. debated damage control, Mexico was already building the future. In less than a week, Mexico's trade envoys signed memoranda of understanding with port authorities in China, India, Brazil, and the UAE. Tomatoes once bound for California were rerouted to Shanghai. Steel previously headed to Detroit was redirected to Sao Paulo. This wasn't retaliation, it was evolution. Sheinbaum's administration coined a new economic doctrine, sovereignty first. No more bowing to tariffs. No more playing second fiddle. Mexico wasn't burning bridges with the U.S., it was building new ones with the global South. Then came the headline that stunned geopolitical circles: Mexico to attend BRICS Plus Summit in Rio. And not just as an observer. Invitations were extended to join BRICS financial structures, including the BRICS Development Bank, bypassing IMF and World Bank frameworks. A move that was unthinkable even 5 years ago. Asian investors reacted immediately. Shipping companies from Singapore to Istanbul began establishing new logistics corridors. Meanwhile, America's media wavered between panic and propaganda. CNN and Fox News called Mexico reckless, but even they admitted the damage was real and growing. While Washington blamed Sheinbaum, some analysts saw something deeper. What if the tariffs were never just about trade? Could it be that the second Trump administration's hardline strategy was less about protecting U.S. workers and more about giving American corporations a pretext to offshore operations? Consider the sequence. Trump hikes tariffs. U.S. supply chains collapse. Mexico pivots to BRICS. Wall Street firms quietly shift assets into emerging markets. A shocking parallel emerges. Is America's trade chaos a geopolitical accident or an engineered evolution? Let's be clear, this isn't about tomatoes. It's not even about tariffs. It's about tectonic power shifts. About who sets the rules of trade in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar. Mexico's bold move shattered decades of quiet subservience. It inspired whispers across Latin America. Leaders from Chile, Argentina, and Colombia began floating the idea of a new regional trade bloc, one that doesn't orbit around Washington. So, here's the chilling question. If Mexico can do this, who's next? The United States now faces a choice. Double down, escalate tensions, and risk a full-blown economic Cold War. Or renegotiate with respect and acknowledge the rise of sovereign powers in the Western Hemisphere. The world is watching. The old rules are crumbling, and the new order it's being written without Washington's pen. Comment below, should the U.S. renegotiate with respect or retaliate harder to regain control? And if others follow Mexico's lead, is America ready for a world where its dominance is no longer guaranteed? What happened between Mexico and the United States wasn't just a disruption in trade. It was a geopolitical revelation. For decades, Mexico had played the role of a quiet supplier, fueling the U.S. economy with cheap produce, industrial parts, and raw materials. The relationship, though economically beneficial, had always been one-sided. America dictated the terms. Mexico complied until it didn't. When President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration pulled the brakes on major exports in response to a wave of new tariffs from Trump's second-term White House, it didn't just stop trucks at the border. It sent shockwaves across global supply chains. Prices for everyday goods in the U.S. surged. Supermarkets issued alerts. American farmers, longtime beneficiaries of cheap cross-border trade, found themselves suddenly isolated from vital inputs. And as the crisis deepened, a stark realization emerged: the United States depended on Mexico far more than it ever admitted. Yet, this wasn't simply an emotional backlash. Mexico's actions were calculated and deliberate. While U.S. lobbyists scrambled for solutions and the media searched for scapegoats, Mexico was already pivoting, signing memoranda with China, India, Brazil, and the UAE. Ports that once served the U.S. market exclusively were now aligning with new trade blocs. Mexico wasn't collapsing under pressure. It was evolving. This crisis teaches us that protectionism, when deployed without empathy or foresight, can backfire catastrophically. The Trump administration intended to apply pressure, but what they activated instead was a sovereign assertion. Mexico made it clear this is not about retaliation, it's about redefinition. Economic sovereignty had become more valuable than access to any single market, even one as large as the United States. Moreover, the pivot to BRICS and beyond highlighted how the global trade map is being redrawn. The idea of a single economic core centered in Washington is being replaced by a multipolar world where power is distributed and contested. Countries that once felt economically subordinate are now embracing strategic diversification. They're exploring financial institutions outside the IMF and World Bank. They're forming trade routes that circumvent Western oversight. And they're doing so not out of desperation, but out of confidence. Perhaps the most powerful moment in the crisis came not from a politician, but from a Texas agribusiness executive who, in a live interview, said, "We need them more than they need us." That statement cracked the ideological armor that had shielded Washington's policy for decades. It exposed a truth many in the heartland are now beginning to feel, that the global economy is built not just on Wall Street and Washington, but on silent agreements, mutual trust, and supply chains that run both ways. Mexico didn't burn bridges. It built new ones. It did not yell, it acted. And that in itself is a lesson. Real strength isn't in bluster or brute force. It lies in preparation, flexibility, and timing. What Mexico showed the world is that even so-called lesser powers can alter the trajectory of global trade if they're willing to take calculated risks. This is not the end of U.S.-Mexico trade, but it is the end of an era where America could assume compliance without consequence. From now on, trade will be negotiated with more respect, more caution, and a sharper awareness of just how quickly the tables can turn. In a world where geopolitical alliances are shifting and economic influence is increasingly fluid, the Mexico crisis stands as a wake-up call. It tells every nation, regardless of size or status, that sovereignty matters. Alliances can shift overnight, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. What makes this moment even more significant is the emotional shift it triggered, not just in markets, but in political psychology across the Western Hemisphere. Mexico's bold stance resonated far beyond its own borders. In Chile and Argentina, government officials publicly applauded the decision. In Bolivia and Colombia, leaders began speaking of forming new trade blocs, new coalitions, and regional economic structures free from U.S. influence. Even activists in Brazil started adopting Sheinbaum's phrase, "This is not retaliation. This is evolution," as a slogan for broader anti-dependency movements. This wasn't just a Mexican maneuver, it became a continental awakening. For the United States, the economic fallout was immediate, and visible empty shelves delayed factory output, skyrocketing prices. But the deeper cost was symbolic. The crisis revealed that the assumptions underpinning America's trade dominance had grown brittle. It exposed the fragility of overconfidence and the danger of underestimating the leverage of so-called junior partners. In truth, Mexico didn't just retaliate against a tariff, it challenged the unspoken contract that had long governed North-South trade relations, the idea that access to the American market was worth any concession, any silence, any compromise. By breaking that contract, Mexico opened the door for others to ask the same question. What if we say no? And perhaps that's the greatest fear now creeping into Washington. Think tanks, not just the economic disruption of a single trade partner, but the possibility that others may follow. What if Brazil chooses to reroute its soy exports? What if Colombia limits rare earth supplies? What if Latin America, long regarded as America's economic backyard, stops asking for permission? This isn't a hypothetical. It's already happening. Mexico's shift was swift, coordinated, and embraced by other rising economies. China responded within weeks, absorbing Mexican goods, offering discounted freight routes, and deepening ties with a nation once seen as firmly in the American orbit. India and Russia have reportedly entered talks to establish new trilateral forums with Mexico, bypassing traditional Western institutions entirely. What's clear now is that we are entering a new phase in global commerce, one where influence must be earned, not assumed, where alliances are based on mutual respect, not legacy hierarchy, and where the ability to pivot, to diversify, to build new trade routes is just as powerful as having the biggest GDP. If the United States wants to lead in this new world, it must abandon the illusion of untouchability. It must recognize that tariffs aren't just economic tools, they are signals, and sometimes those signals trigger avalanches. Mexico's move was bold, it was disruptive, but above all, it was inevitable. For decades, the world has lived under the weight of unspoken rules set by a handful of power centers. Today, those rules are being rewritten, not with fanfare but with freight containers quietly changing course, with trade envoys landing in new capitals, with leaders like Claudia Sheinbaum showing that quiet resolve can be just as revolutionary as loud confrontation. The question now is not whether Mexico can maintain its position, but whether the U.S. can adapt to a world that no longer waits for it to lead. In this evolving landscape, every nation will have to make choices. Will they cling to familiar dependencies or step into unfamiliar autonomy? Will they fear disruption or use it as a chance to evolve? Mexico made its choice. Now the world watches to see who's next. As the situation unfolds, one element becomes undeniable. This isn't merely a bilateral rift between two neighbors. It's a blueprint. A new template for how smaller nations long considered subordinate can reclaim agency in a system designed without their full consent. In classrooms, economic forums, and diplomatic circles across Latin America, the question is no longer, can we survive without the U.S., but rather, why haven't we tried sooner? The Mexican example shows that even deeply intertwined economies can be rerouted if the willpower and preparation align. That's not just strategic agility, it's structural courage. But the courage came at a cost. Mexico had to absorb initial losses, issue emergency subsidies, and activate logistical overhauls. Critics in the U.S. labeled the move rash or self-destructive. Yet, within weeks, data told a different story. Exports to Asia surged, the peso held steady, and Sheinbaum's approval ratings climbed to historic highs. It turned out that risking economic sovereignty was not just symbolic, it was economically viable. What Mexico understood, and what others are beginning to emulate, is that global power is no longer held solely by those who control capital. It's held by those who control flexibility. Those who can move supply chains faster than sanctions. Those who can partner without needing permission. Those who know that alliances rooted in dependence are no longer safe. The ripple effects have already reached Europe. In Brussels and Berlin, analysts are reconsidering assumptions about nearshoring, about the future of NAFTA, and about whether Western institutions can remain relevant without coercive leverage. If Latin America is shifting eastward, what happens to transatlantic alignment? If BRICS becomes BRICS Plus and Mexico joins as a full member, how long before others follow? In the United States, a quiet panic simmers. The political class is divided, some calling for doubling down on tariffs and punitive measures, others urging de-escalation before the exodus accelerates. Meanwhile, average Americans feel the shift not in policy papers but in grocery bills, in delayed shipments, in the rising cost of living. They may not know the term geoeconomic realignment, but they live its consequences every day. And through it all, President Sheinbaum has remained resolute. Not fiery, not reactive, just calm, methodical, and unmoved by Washington's threats. That image alone, a Latin American leader standing firm as America flails, may be the most powerful lesson of all. Because this is no longer about economics, it's about dignity. It's about rewriting the logic of global trade so that respect becomes part of the equation again. So that access is mutual, not dictated. So that sovereignty is recognized not just in war, but in every truckload of tomatoes and every cargo ship full of steel. The post-American trade world isn't coming. It's already here. The only question left is who's ready to operate in it. There's another layer to this story that makes it even more consequential, the ideological one. Mexico's break with the U.S. wasn't just an act of economic independence. It was a rupture from a belief system that had long governed the Western Hemisphere, that economic value flows north and political legitimacy flows south. This belief, unspoken yet deeply embedded, had for decades justified the imbalance in global decision-making. Latin America,